Immersive visual experiences, what's that about? What does it mean? And why is AVI-SPL getting involved with it?
Well, XTG is getting involved in it. XTG is a new business unit that was launched at the beginning of this year. Stands for Experience Technology Group. There is a reason why we wanted a unique brand because, as you know, AVI-SPL has been known for many years of being great at doing conference rooms and traditional AV technology. But for many years, we have actually been doing a lot of experiential type projects. We just haven't really identified to the market in that way. And what we saw was a huge market opportunity to do this, but we had to create a brand, and that is what XTG is, that we could actually take to the market that would actually represent our value in those experiential technology spaces. The reason we did it at the beginning of this year is because we see a mass market opportunity for that, and it's growing exponentially. And so we see that in two particular ways. Number one, customers the world over are trying to reinvent their customer relationship, and it's happening in a number of different markets. So enterprises are building innovation centers, experience centers, visitor environments, and that's a big market. But also retail is trying to change the whole way they engage their customers in these immersive, high-value spaces.
Well, the people are using these really high lofty, high convoluted words, but a lot of the experience centres are sales rooms, and they're not really what I would call an experience. The question of, we're going from basic connectivity to a hybrid environment seems to be changing as we go along. It's that holistic, deeper thinking going on that I'm thinking, what are companies what model are companies working to, and how integrators are coping with. Now that everybody's called themselves a service or a solution provider, it's now becoming a little more difficult to see what people are experiencing and where their skill set lies.
Well, let's go back to what you said about companies are building these experience centers because it's just a sales pitch. They're looking to sell things.
I think they're good, by the way. I'm not against the idea. It's fantastic, but let's say what they are.
But let's talk about the sales pitch. Yes, they want sales conversion. I mean, that's how they get funding to create these spaces. But many organizations are actually looking at these environments in a slightly different way. Partly because the way that the world is going right now, there's a lot of uncertainty and there's a lot of new business models spinning out at the moment. So a lot of these organizations are actually trying to engage their customers in the storytelling of what the possibilities could be moving forward and what they're doing as an organization to prepare for that and how to build confidence with their customers that they are, they have vision and they're investing in the right kinds of things. So a good example is a multi-award-winning center we built with T-Mobile in Seattle, which is called their 5G and Me Experience Center. And that is all about storytelling about the possibilities of 5G. And so the way they've organized it is not a show of products and sell products. It is, here are the future potential applications of what 5G could do to transform the world. And actually engaging in, that's where the immersive technology is really coming together to help to tell those stories.
So it's an individual piece of technology that's within an existing infrastructure that serves a sales purpose and gets a strong message across.
Well, you don't get to build these immersive experiences by just one piece of technology. In fact, you just don't have just technology. And the thing that XTG is focused on is a very extensive ecosystem of partners that comprise lots of different organizations doing different things to help create that experience. So we work with architects, interior designers, with experience designers, content creators, fabricators, brand agencies, and we are the technology advisor and partner to those ecosystem of partners to combine all of that together into a holistic solution to the customer. And if we can translate this to the Avixa story just for a moment, if you remember the rebranding that happened several years ago now, and it used to be called Infocom, and then suddenly this Avixa brand came. AV, an Integrated Experience Association. So we've been talking about AV for a long time, but now you see experience everywhere in the show. And I think part of that is to try and understand not necessarily what is the technology can be done with AV, but what can we help our customers to achieve in helping them to transform, whether that's their sales message, whether that's employee experience or even education. where we're finding a huge amount of engagement in that space.
Yes,
too.
I'm sure there are. I mean, it's still, the difficulty I have is in differentiating between the customized environments that experience centres tend to be and the overall level of potential experience or new environments that really are a transformation, digitization, if you like, of existing legacy system infrastructures that are established as IT. Now companies having to rethink how their entire infrastructure works in order to make it properly digital and to incorporate AV in a strategic way at the centre of how they operate.
And you know, we've talked about convergence a lot over many years, and the old story of AV and IT convergence, that's a long old story. But I think we're seeing convergence in many other areas as well, and it's all coming together into one space. So take broadcast as a great example. You know, we've tended to look, which is why we have an NAB show, we sort of have a broadcast conversation over here, and we sort of think that broadcast is different from AV. No, it's not. In fact, through COVID and through the emergence of hybrid experiences, we're seeing a massive investment in organizations in building extended reality studios. Effectively, that is, you could say it's broadcast, but effectively it's AV technology that is driving that, along with augmented reality and virtual reality. So we're now starting to see not only AV and IT, we're seeing elements of broadcast, and we're actually also seeing elements of these advanced emerging technologies like AR and VR coming together. So that's really the space that we're in XTG, is it's really how do we bring that ecosystem of partners as well as these emerging and traditional technologies and actually create these new solutions that are serving the needs of our customers right now.
Well, it's interesting, I get all that, but you know, in terms of AV and IT merger, I mean, that's going to be a long story. It's still going on, and thank goodness for Teams and Zoom, because therefore, for the first time, you've got properly featured UC that people recognise and understand, and people can focus on as a sort of hub of what they're doing around that and building it out. Potentially, I don't know, but there is this still nagging doubt in my head about virtual studios, virtual production, and everything else. That really is still a gulf between, and we've just done a big AV broadcast supplement. Two very separate markets, having some crossover, and they are sort of two brothers, if you like, but living in different houses. I think there's still a bit of a gulf between what the AV community sees it can get out of it, where its skills are needed, and how it can implement what is, our customer, very expensive stuff, but justified by building it much more robustly into an infrastructure they know is flexible enough to accommodate anything they want to bolt onto it. That's a tough gig, isn't it, for most AVs?
The word that...
It's not AV anymore, is it, for a start?
Well...
there are elements of it, I think.
You mentioned Microsoft. If you talk to the folks at Microsoft, they have a resurgence of interest about AV right now in Microsoft. So AV has not gone away, and it is not irrelevant. It's actually more relevant than it's ever been. And the reason why Microsoft are interested in AV, because they realize that actually to get MS Teams to be fully adopted across the enterprise, they have to really light up the meeting room, and they have to be able to create that sort of really engaging meeting room experience. They figured out that AV is the way to actually do that. And so you also mentioned flexibility. The design principles that everyone coming out of the pandemic, and as we look at the workplace of the future, flexibility and adaptability now need to be the center of the design process. People, first of all, human-centered design, absolutely, but the attributes need to be flexible and adaptable. So these big monolithic sort of infrastructure projects where everything is fixed, sort of buy, own, operate model that we've had in IT and AV for a number of years, we're seeing a need to disrupt that model. So people are investing in technology platforms that can adapt and be flexible, moved around, and they're sacrificing some of that big architecture, big tin type approach, which is a good thing in many ways if you think about it, because we can't actually get a lot of big tin right now. It's stuck in ports and ships around the world and semiconductor plants. So we're seeing a number of emergence of technologies that have been relatively slow to take off that are now blowing up. So software as a service, trying to actually take functionality that only hardware appliances used to be able to do, and we're now seeing that translated into software and service delivery. So the key message to everybody in the AV industry really is that coming out of this pandemic, even though everything wasn't always about the pandemic because things were changing beforehand, you have to now adapt and grow, and you have to leave a lot of old stuff behind you and open your minds to the opportunities of these new technologies coming forward. The trick, and this is why XTG was designed in the way it was, is how do we aggregate all of those different technologies and architecture and design and content and be able to bring that together into solutions that can actually prove value to the customer.
So it's a tail wagging a dog, in other words, in a sense.
I don't mind being
yeah,
wagged at all.
One does wonder, actually, what the motivation Microsoft's had, and apart from the service somebody else. I mean, you never got the impression that Microsoft was remotely aware of what the AV market was doing until they started shifting large numbers of screens. And of course, now that Teams is almost suspiciously becoming a new version of Windows that everything plugs into, we're dealing with the birth of a fantastically new, probably more relevant environment that people see a future for when they're doing big corporate installs. So in a sense, that hopefully might add a strand to making whatever you add onto it much more straightforward, and people are, again, still the big proprietary standard. But the other thing is, standards and interoperability, not two fantastic areas that the AV market's been renowned for, which are going to have to be de rigueur in the next 4 or 5 years.
They have to be now. But going back to the Microsoft thing, if there is a futures deck that Microsoft, the sales team and executives have that they present to all the Fortune 500 companies, and they have a slide with Microsoft front row, if you've seen that particular picture, showing the big sort of display and all of your content and all the people and everything all coming together into one place. That is the Microsoft story around the future of Teams. What's interesting, if you look to the top of that graphic, you will actually see projectors in the ceiling displaying that content. Who would have thought Microsoft would be talking about AV projectors actually providing that integrated immersive experience? So that's why I was saying about AV is not gone away. It is more relevant and as healthy as it's probably ever been as we are emerging through the next phase.
I do think when you mention collaboration as a service, that is almost a new word for AV. I mean, AV will cease to be a word that we are, although familiar with, continue to use in its current sense. I think collaboration is something more like where we're going with this, which is much more all-encompassing, that potentially opens up new areas that add into traditional IT, but it makes it more flexible and takes into account the visual interface and the experience, not necessarily for dramatic product intros or anything else, but actually improves the experience for anybody using a corporate environment that makes it more intuitive.
Yeah, an interesting thing. Yeah, an interesting thing happened in March of 2020, not just the pandemic, but the reaction that the world had to what the pandemic caused. So everyone left their offices and they all went home. But you have to look at what happened in the background there. What people were doing is they were going home to their relatively inexpensive consumer devices, so a laptop with a camera and microphone. They were accessing a software that was provisioned mostly in the cloud, and they were using relatively good broadband internet access that most people around the world, not everybody, but a lot of people around the world had. And it wasn't just happening with office workers, it was happening in education, in healthcare, pretty much every aspect of life. The lesson that's been taught back to the IT owners and the service providers globally is that when you have cloud, when you have the ability to distribute work almost overnight simultaneously, and you can get access to relatively inexpensive devices and bandwidth, that is a flexibility model that you now need to take back into your large corporate design and actually start redesigning the way you think about your infrastructure moving forward. Because the world would not have survived if it wasn't for what happened with that approach. And so what we're now seeing is people starting to move away from that sort of buy, build, own, operate model where everything is capitalized and depreciated over a 5-year period. And that's affecting AV as much as it has always affected IT in the last 10, 15 years. So as we've moved to software as a service and all the rest of it. So really all we're doing now is recognizing that the market demand for flexibility, adaptability, user models is now actually, in many ways, just being replicated from where we've already been with IT, but the use case for AV and UC is here and now. So when we talk about collaboration as a service, we're not just talking about bundling the hardware with the service and what have you. We're actually talking about a fundamentally different business model. We're moving away from a buy, build, own and operate, depreciate model to something which is more about service provision and service use, and that's changing the way people think about paying for things as well.
Yeah.
So it's something in the AV industry that we shouldn't be, number one, frightened of. It is something that we have to be prepared for. But I believe, especially now when it's difficult to get hold of hardware and what have you, if you want to accelerate your revenues, you really have to start adopting these kind of models to build revenue annuity and customer loyalty over a longer period of time. And hopefully if we do that, we'll start breaking away from our old transactional model where we're just waiting for the next deal and the next project. We can actually start planning our customer journeys over a longer period of time. And that's something we've been talking about for a long time, but the opportunity to do that is here and now.
Well, at least collaboration now is not the emperor's clothes anymore. We're adding more layers of definition to justify what it is, what elements go into it perhaps, and everything else. Because as we move increasingly towards this service provision, complex though it is, I do wonder what we're going to call integrators, whether they're going to solutional service provider, whoever they are, what skills are going to be required, or what expertise and levels and application now they're going to need, is as we move towards, are we going to be focusing more on quality of service, making sure the support, maintenance, and development of a much bigger, and hopefully not as complex environment. If we go the Microsoft route, that will tie a lot of disparate elements together. Hopefully. Yep. That might give people a bit of a bone to work on.
And we're seeing a huge increase in demand for our Symphony platform, for example.
Yeah, and about that.
Yeah, and Symphony is that sort of aggregation of all of these different monitoring and management services that we provide for our customers so that they can see all of their technology estate. But what's interesting is we're now not just looking at managing their AV and their IoT assets or whatever it is they have on the network. People are actually saying, I need to look at everything. I need to be able to look at what's happening in the building, the utilization of space. I want to look at how I can understand workflow. And so what we're starting to see is the need with our APIs to actually start bringing out other services that are looking at other aspects of work and present everything as that single pane of glass. So again, what started as a very sort of excellent asset management and node management system is now taking on a very different role. And it's very difficult, of course, if you want to be a service provider and you want to be able to have that relationship with your customer about everything that's happening. You need a platform like that to be able to do that at scale for your customers. So we're seeing huge growth in that. And we've also launched our collaboration as a service offerings as well. Interestingly, actually piloted in the UK before we then rolled it out into the US. And part of the reason for that is that actually the UK and Europe is a little bit further ahead in their understanding and adoption of those models than the US.
Why do you think that is?
I think partly because European markets tend to be a little bit more competitive. And therefore there's a lot of drive for differentiation in the market, and I think there are some innovators that have actually come up and actually brought these kind of techniques and offerings to the market a little bit more in Europe ahead of time to gain competitive advantage, and that's actually helped people to actually understand the model and learn and appreciate it. Obviously, when you go into the US market, you have to be prepared to scale up at a big level. So our decision was, let's try it in a market that has a greater understanding of it. Let's see how it gets adopted, and now let's actually, when we're ready, we'll scale it up into the US.
Are we reaching up to a level of responsibility, the strategic responsibility, that's going to really have CIOs managing all this? Have we got up to that level yet, or is that going to be coming along? Because you feel as though, the use of technology in its all pervasive way, when you're looking at, technology that's more infrastructure than it is individual technology, and the cohesive, bigger look at what the picture is for the whole company, you're then suddenly into territory, the CXO territory of management justification and funding for the board. And so, well, this is just as important in our company.
Yeah.
But whatever we do with this,
Yeah.
it's very closely aligned to how the business is going to be performing, expanding, and being agile over the next few years.
Well,
I say few, I mean 5.
Yeah, what's interesting, Clive, is that we're not just talking to more and more CIOs, which we are, than we've ever done. We're actually talking to CHROs, the Chief Human Resource Officer. We're actually getting access to more CEOs. The C-level interest around what AV and unified communications and experience technology can provide the organization is now fairly and squarely on the table of the C-levels in organizations. Why? Because they absolutely understand that they have major challenges ahead of them right now about how do they engage their employees? How do I get my people back into the office? And they need to make sure that they shift away from just building robust offices and immune IT systems. They now need to actually say, we need to engage our people, encourage them to come back. We have a staff retention problem. The whole sort of grand resignation, what have you, is a real issue for everybody around the world. And so these are C-level problems and they are engaged right now in contributing not only funding, importantly, but also a huge amount of interest and input about how these technologies can help them to achieve their goals.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because we're coming from the AV end, they're coming from the IT end, and we're in this flux of middle ground where everybody's CIOs want a bit more knowledge and expertise of how our side's working. We want more knowledge of how it gels into the bigger end of their end of the company. And I'd say that's a very lucrative middle ground that ties everybody together quite nicely.
Well, you know, going all the way back to the beginning of the conversation around XTG, why? The reason we exist is because there is a functional design process, which is where we've traditionally been with buildings and AV. In other words, I need something done, give me a functional design that achieves that goal. So we've been doing functional design for years and years and years. The IT conversation comes in, and then it's a platform conversation, which is it's Microsoft, it's Cisco, or whatever. So that tends to be much more of an IT-centric design conversation. You still do functional design, but usually as a consequence of that platform design. The experience design process, the X, is actually a different design process as well, because actually we're engaging multiple people into the conversation. It's not just IT, it's not just facilities. It is HR, it is the business leadership, it is sales and marketing, because they want to be able to ensure that whatever they're doing as an organization is actually integrated and is actually serving the needs both for their customers and their employees. And so we're now seeing what I call the XPF factor, is you're seeing experience design, platform design, and functional design all coming together. And that's really where the sweet spot is, because if you can crack that code, then I think you've got a very healthy way that you can engage your customers and infinite revenue possibilities as well.
I think they're huge. But the thing is, you're suddenly thinking of workspace being quite a narrow definition of the term. You're looking at a much bigger market that needs a new word. I think collaboration, a redefinition of collaboration may well be the way forward, because that's the ultimate goal of the company, to be functioning efficiently and putting whatever it is of any use, using whatever technology you need, to work effectively and into production almost immediately, because there's not much time for this. There are huge budgets involved, potentially, but the people are seeing it as strategic,
Yep.
you know, are able to justify their spend and think, for the first time most probably, we need a disruption to make people think differently, and get the reason for the funding, and they have a good excuse to do so, which you wouldn't normally be able to do.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. I'm seeing the term workplace disappearing, because if you think about it, that determines that you're actually in a place, or in the place, as in the office.
From the workspace into this new environment.
The place. So effectively, we're actually just seeing it as work. And the question is, how are we going to work in the future? And that is not just around buildings, and it's not just around technology. It's actually, you know, what is the purpose of a meeting, for example? We're seeing dramatic changes in behavior. not just the behavior of people being able to work remotely, but how they organize their day, how work-life balance has taken on a whole new concept. We're seeing meetings becoming shorter. You know, this concept that you used to plan a meeting and it'd be like, it goes for an hour, that's what we're going to do. And when you analyze what happens in that hour, there's very little productive time that's actually going on in that hour. And so we've seen, and the data supports this, through hybrid work, we're seeing what was an hour meeting now becoming a 30-minute meeting. But people are actually better prepared because they're actually coming with the right information, and they're coming with already, some of the work's already done. The meeting is really a collaboration on how they're going to solve that particular problem, make a decision and move on. But that 30-minute thing is interesting, because if you then say, well, okay, if we're now going to have 30-minute meetings, do I need to design conference rooms that have a dirty great piece of wood in the middle of it with chairs around the outside where everyone sits down and is passive sitting down? Probably not. Why don't we actually just create a huddle space where people gather and maybe lounge around on chairs or what have you, gathering around an interactive display where they have the meeting, people coming in remotely, and they can walk out? That has massive implications for the way we think about the design of buildings and offices, and it will mean that we can actually use space much more imaginatively and build some of those brand ideals. In other words, I free up what was very dull, boring office and meeting rooms, and I can now create much more engaging, much more inspirational and motivational spaces that give reasons for people to come into the office. So yes, there's a lot of change going on, but leadership is all about creating that reality, because the rule book of how we used to do things doesn't exist anymore. So a lot of it is about how do we experiment and how do we do new things.
I mean, Apple did that, didn't it, in the building of this new donut building, and things went really badly wrong. Because those who wanted to work and have been used to working individually, which is where they got their inspiration and their effectiveness from, were suddenly thrust into a much more open environment. They found it the complete distraction and were out of their comfort zone in a sense.
Well, did you see the recent news is that Tim Cook has now mandated 3 days a week in Apple at headquarters, and they had a recent survey and 67% of Apple employees said no, that's not what we want. So when you get to a point where 2/3 of your employees, who are very transportable within the Silicon Valley market, they can go anywhere they wish, are suddenly saying that's not what we want, he has to listen. The organization has to listen. So the rise of employee power and the ability to have an influence over what decisions leadership actually make about their workplace and their technology and how people are working is more significant than it's ever been in recent history. So I think that's why we're seeing right now that everything that we do around workplace can't just be about the building, and it can't just be about the technology. We have to put people and human ambition and human needs and well-being at the center of that design, because if we don't, our most valuable assets will go elsewhere and they will make other choices.
That was the single most effective element of our recent AV Works conference, which was looked at property, technology, and everything else, and the one that came right at the top of the list was more the human, softer factors that people had totally not registered to at all and thought. We'd all accepted that processes would be tightened up, everything would become more efficient and more effective, but no one actually thought what impact that would have on the well-being of people and their effectiveness in working better than they were, and creating innovative thought and actually helping them to improve what they did. So the collaboration process itself actually added to their value rather than took it away as a handicap.
If you think about what happened, again, if we could fast forward back to March 2020, it's probably the biggest single experiment that mankind has ever had, on the basis that the whole world went through a singular event that affected everybody in the same way instantaneously. And everybody responded to it. It was almost like outsourcing a disaster, really. And everybody responded to it and actually realized that there was a different way that they could actually work and meet a lot of their work-life challenges and balances and solve some of the problems that they were really struggling with in the old work style. These are behaviors and attitudes that are not going to just change when you ask people to come back into the office. So a lot of people had this sort of return to office mentality. Well, we sort of do that just for now, but when the pandemic goes and we've got vaccines, we can get everyone back and we'll go back to the way we were and everyone will be happy. No, they won't. They've already learnt new ways. They've already accepted that they can be productive, and that all the data demonstrates that productivity has risen during the pandemic. It has not gone down. So I think the smart organizations are recognizing that that fundamental change in the way we think about work and the way we work is something to be embraced and encouraged, not to be throttled and not to try and go back to the way of before. But as designers of work and the technology that goes that, we have to respond to that too, which means we have to design for the future accepting that there's been fundamental change. And I will argue it is very different from the workplaces we were designing 4 or 5 years ago. So the AV and associated industries now have to be much braver to think differently. We have to listen to what is happening out there. We have to be very observational. Never ask somebody what they want and then design what they say they want, because people behave very differently from what they say they want. But we have to be observational about what is actually going on out there. And so observation, when we talk about workplace, means we do have to invest in things like IoT sensors and things that actually watch what goes on in the workplace, watch how people work, their behaviors, where they're moving and what have you. So suddenly in the AV world, we're not just talking about meeting room technology and UCC and experiential stuff. We're actually talking about the opportunity to integrate IoT and all these other elements into our solution stack as well. It keeps on growing the market opportunity we have. And again, as I said, the market opportunity is now. And so anybody involved in this, whether you're a manufacturer, or a distributor, or an integrator, reseller, or a consultant, we should be gearing up for this and getting ready for that, because if we're not, other people will fill that void.